Hello, my name's Froschauer. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about bats. As we're going along through the presentation, you're welcome to chat questions to me. I'll try to answer those as I go along if I can. I might let you know that I'm going to talk about that a little bit later if it's something that I'm planning to talk about. And then at the end, we'll hopefully have some time to talk as well. So just want to do a quick check with our moderators. Are you all able to hear me okay over there? All right, great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about bats. Usually when I tell people I work with bats, they say something like, "You work with what?" And I say bats. And then a lot of times they say something like, "Ew, that's gross," or "Bats are scary," or things like that. So I don't think they are. I think they're super adorable, and they're also really one of the coolest kinds of creatures out there. And so hopefully by the end of the day today and the end of my talk and some of the questions you all might have, maybe if there's some folks out there that don't like bats, I can help change your mind a little bit and you'll love bats just as much as I do. So talk a little bit about what I do. I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a communications specialist, which means I do all kinds of communication work. I work with scientists, I work with the media, I work with the public, including students. So I talk to classrooms a lot, and I'm really excited to be here. I think this is my 4th year at the National Biodiversity Teach-In, so I'm glad you're here with me too. And one of my jobs is to communicate about wildlife issues. But that's what I do in the daytime, but at night what I do is I work with biologists and scientists on bat research projects. I also work with outreach organizations to help educate people about bats. So basically, I like to think of myself like a wildlife superhero because I have a night job working with bats. So how do you get to work with bats? If you're interested in doing something like working with bats, I studied at The Ohio State University. I studied natural resources there. People that are interested in studying bats or other wildlife oftentimes study things like biology, ecology, or wildlife management. And actually, there's several universities that have bat labs where all they do is study bats. So if you're interested in studying bats when you get to college, you can always look for something like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about bats worldwide. There's over 1,300 species of bats worldwide. And actually, my friend Nancy that works at the American Museum for Natural History in New York City, they're in charge of kind of keeping track of how many species of bats. And I actually just sent her a message this morning to see what the number of bat species are, and it's currently at 1,395. So I'll probably have to update my slide next year to more bats species than I have on there now. So there's over a 1/5 of the mammal species on Earth are actually bats. And they live in almost every place on Earth except for the most extreme desert and polar regions. So almost anywhere that you live, there's bats. Maybe you don't see them, maybe you don't know they're there, but they probably are. So I have a question here from Mrs. B's classroom, which is, how did I become interested in bats? Well, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and there's a natural history museum there that has a big fake cave in it, and there's actually a colony of bats that they keep in the fake cave to help educate people about bats. And we would go there on school field trips and things when I was younger, and I just fell in love with them. I thought they were really cute and they're super unique, and hopefully I can share some of that with you today. So I'll talk a little bit more about what makes bats special here in a minute. So there's basically 2 major groups of bats. There's the megabats and then there's the microbats. Just kind of like the name implies, megabats are the really big bats and microbats are the small bats. The smallest bat in the world is called the bumblebee bat. It's actually also known as Kitty's hognose bat. They have a little kind of piggy-looking nose there. They're the smallest mammal in the world, and they actually weigh less than a penny. These bats live in Thailand and Burma. On the other end of the spectrum, the biggest bats in the world are flying foxes. Some of them can have up to a 6-foot wingspan. So if you live somewhere that has vultures, that you might see turkey vultures or black vultures, that's about the size of those bats' wingspans. They're really big bats, but they're also fruit-eating bats. So while they may look big and intimidating, they're actually really sweet fruit-eating bats. And most of those bats live in the Philippines. There's also lots of different shapes and sizes and faces of bats. I think bats are really cute, and here's what I think is the cutest bat. This is called the Honduran tent-making bat. They kind of look like little white puffy cotton balls with yellow ears, and they have a little leaf nose. They're very small. These bats actually do a really cool thing. You can see that picture there where they're all clustered together under a leaf. What they actually do is chew along the edge of the leaf and make it fold down like a tent, and then they go up and roost underneath that tent in the daytime. So if there's any predators flying above them, like birds or other mammals, they can't see them, and then if there are things on the ground, the light coming through the leaf sort of gives them a greenish color, and they're not as visible to predators that may be looking for a tasty snack. So I think that's really cool. Bats are also really beneficial. They do so much hard work all around the world. They do things like pest control for crops. So things that we like to eat, corn and tomato and watermelons and lots of crops that we like to eat, bats provide a lot of pest control. They eat the insects that eat those crops. There's also bats that pollinate. So if you like things like bananas or cashews or avocados, there's hundreds of different plants that are pollinated by bats. And one of the other important things they do is they disperse seeds, especially in tropical areas. So they eat those fruits and they either spit the seeds out or they pass through their digestive tract and they pass them as guano. Bat poop is called guano. And they drop those seeds where they're flying around and they help spread those seeds around. So what do bats eat? Most of the bats eat insects. So about 2/3 of the bat species eat insects. There's also bats that eat pollen, they eat fruit, they eat nectar. There's even a few kinds of bats that eat meat. Some bats eat things like frogs or fish. There's even bats that fly over water and use their great big feet to catch fish out of the water. And there are 3 species of bats. They don't live in the US, but they live in Central America and South America that do eat blood. They're vampire bats, but it's not like vampire bats we see in movies. And I see a couple more questions here. Let me look here. Let's see. What education do you need to do your job? From Micah in Mrs. B's class. I have a master's degree, so I went to college and got my bachelor's degree in science, and then I got a master's degree also in science. In natural resources management to do my job. But lots of people get different kinds of education to do jobs like this. There's biologists, there's other natural resource managers, there's ecologists. So usually science kind of degrees are the kind of education that you need to do things like work at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All right, Ashton in Mrs. B's class asked what my favorite species of bat is. I'd have to say it's hard to pick, but one of my favorite species of bat is called a pallid bat. They live in sort of like the desert southwest and desert west of the US. And those bats are really cool. They have really pale fur, so they're kind of light colored, and they have really gigantic ears. And they use those really gigantic ears to actually listen for animals walking on the ground. So things like centipedes and scorpions, they actually eat scorpions. So the scorpions will even sometimes sting them and they don't seem to care. They just eat those scorpions anyway. So I think those bats are really cool. Let's see. Somebody says, let's see, my favorite experience working with bats, there's so many. I really like to go out and go do cave surveys where we go in caves and look for bats and count them and see if they're healthy. Do I have a pet bat or pet bats? I do not. Actually, bats aren't very good pets. They're wild animals, so we don't want to try to keep wild animals. Sometimes we do have educational bats that are used to help educate people about bats. So yeah, I don't have any pet bats or education bats, but I have worked with education bats, and they can be really important for helping people see how cool bats are. And let's see, Kenzie says, how do I respond when somebody says bats are ugly? Well, I personally think bats are really adorable. That bat I showed you before, the white one with the little yellow nose, I think is one of the cutest bats. So sometimes I'll try to show people pictures of bats that I think are really cute. I think they have really cute little faces. So you can't change everybody's mind, but a lot of times people just have an idea of what bats look like and they've never actually seen one. So showing them pictures sometimes helps. All right, and one last question, and then I'm going to move on to more slides and pictures. As David H. asks, is it true we should be scared of bats which come out in the daytime? So that's a really great question. I'm going to talk a little bit later about not touching bats. So sometimes there's a disease called rabies, and bats can carry that disease. There's other animals too that carry that disease. One of the things that oftentimes does happen when a bat has rabies is that they do behave oddly, like they come out in the daytime, they might be flopping around on the ground, things like that. So I always say just never touch a bat. If you do see a bat, you should probably go tell an adult. But there are some bats that do go out in the daytime to forage. Usually it's like in the evening before it gets all the way dark. But if you see a bat, it's a really good idea to just go get an adult and let them handle it. So, okay, I'm going to move on and then I'll come back to a couple more of these questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the insect-eating bats. They are the primary predator of night-flying insects. So if you think about animals that are out in the daytime, there's lots of different animals that are out, and there are tons and tons of different kinds of birds that eat insects. So those birds are busy eating insects in the day, but at nighttime, most birds go to sleep, especially the insect-eating birds. So that's a time of day when bats are out. They're nocturnal. So they're really important for eating night-flying insects, things like moths, and a lot of moths are crop pests. There are bats that specialize in different kinds of insects. So some eat moths, some eat beetles or flies or aquatic insects, but there's also bats that'll eat lots of different kinds of insects. And a bat can eat their body weight in insects in one night. So if you think about that and how much you weigh and how much you'd have to eat in one night to be like a bat, for me, that would be like I'd have to eat about 50 large pizzas or 500 quarter-pound hamburgers. Well, you know, I do get really hungry sometimes, but I just don't think I could eat that many. Let's see, talk a little bit more about what makes bats special. They're the only flying mammal. So you might have heard of this animal called a flying squirrel. Well, flying squirrels can't actually fly, they glide, but bats can actually fly. So they're the only flying mammal, which is really cool. And if you look at this picture of the bat, and if you want to notice something, if you look at their wing bones, their wings are pretty much exactly like human hands. They actually have all the same bones in their wings that we have in our hands. They just have those really elongated fingers, and there's skin that grows between all those fingers and then is attached to kind of where their ankle is, and that's what makes their wings. Bats also use echolocation to navigate, communicate, and hunt. So that's actually using sound. So there's a myth out there that bats are blind. You may have heard somebody say blind as a bat, but actually bats can see pretty well. They can see just about as well as humans can. But of course, when they're out at night and they're flying around, oftentimes it's really dark and they can't really use their eyes to navigate or to communicate or to hunt. So they instead use sound. And this is, again, I just want to remind you that they're the main predator of night-flying insects. So if you look at that little picture there, the bats send out a really high-pitched sound. We can't hear it with our ears, but bats can hear it. And that sound bounces off anything that's in their path. So it might be a bug, it might be a tree limb, it might be a building, and that's the bats are able to get a mental picture of what's around them. Bats are really important to science. So we study bats for lots of different reasons. The military studies bats for things like flight and navigation. They look at how bats navigate in three-dimensional space, and they try to use that to develop better aircraft technologies and things like that. We also study bats for medical reasons. Actually, and this is a picture of a little vampire bat. And what vampire bats do is they land on the ground and they sneak up on their prey, usually birds, chickens, livestock, and they make a little teeny tiny cut with some really sharp teeth in the front of their mouth. And then they lick that little cut. And in their saliva is a chemical that makes the blood flow faster. So if you've ever cut yourself, you know that the blood will kind of clot together and make a scab. Well, this chemical in their saliva keeps the blood from doing that so that they're able to feed on that blood. And they eat about 2 teaspoons of blood a day. It's not very much. And then once they are done, they kind of sneak off and they fly away, and that cut will heal. And usually the animal doesn't even know that it was there. But that chemical in their saliva is really important because scientists have been able to create medicine that helps human beings out of that chemical in their saliva. Okay, bats in the US. So we have about 47 different species of bats in the United States. Somebody asked earlier what my favorite bat is. The one on the left, that spotted bat, is one of my other favorite bats. I just think it's super cute. It's got black and white polka dot fur. It's got those giant pink ears and a little cute little face. I just think it's so cute. But most of our bats in the US are insect-eating bats. So about 90% of the bats that live in the US eat insects. But we do have a few bats that eat fruit and nectar and pollen. So on the left there is a bat that's going to a flower on a cactus called a lesser long-nosed bat. And they're actually the only animal that pollinates the agave plants that we use agave in a number of different ways. So you may have heard of agave syrup. Sometimes people use that as a sweetener. And agave plants are also used to make tequila, which is a kind of alcohol that adults like to drink. So without bats, there'd be no agave plants, there'd be no agave syrup, and there'd be no tequila. So what do bats do in the winter? They have a couple different things that they might do. They can hibernate. So some bats will hibernate in places like caves or mines. Those are called hibernacula, the places where bats hibernate. And when they go into their hibernacula, they actually slow down their body functions. So they slow down their breathing, they slow down their heart rate, they make their body temperature a lot lower, and that helps them to conserve enough fat to live through the winter. Also, when they're hibernating, it probably means their immune system isn't as strong as it usually is, and that'll be important in a little while when I talk about some of the threats to bats. Bats can also migrate, so you probably know that some birds migrate. They go south for the winter. Bats also migrate, so sometimes they'll just migrate a short distance from where they are in the summer to where they're going to go hibernate. But there's also bats that can migrate really long distances to where food is available in the winter. So they could fly, like there's bats that live in Texas that fly down to Mexico or Brazil or Central America. So they can fly a really long distance so that they can be somewhere that their food is available in the winter time. All right, before I talk a little bit about threats to bats, I'm going to answer a couple more questions here. Let's see. How long have I worked with bats? Let's see, probably about 15 years. I've been working with bats. How many bats do I see in a year? Well, I probably see hundreds and hundreds of bats. That doesn't necessarily mean I handle that many bats, but I see bats. And I actually have a little bat detector that allows me to hear bats at night. It just plugs into my phone and I can go out and listen to them. And that helps me find them too, because you have to go outside at night and you have to look up in the sky if you want to see bats flying around. So that helps me figure out if there's bats or not. Are there any bats that are not nocturnal? Well, there's some bats in different parts of the world that roost in places that are more visible in the daytime, and they may be more active. So you might have seen videos of some of the fruit bats and things that are in trees, and they're more active in the daytime. Let's see. Did bats carry distemper? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that one. I've never heard of a bat with distemper, but I don't know if they do or not. So that'd be something you'd have to look up. But good question. You stumped me. Connor asking if a vampire has ever bitten a human. Yes, that does occasionally happen. That's not their usual food source, but sometimes they'll get trapped in a house or something like that, and they have been known to bite humans. So somebody asked what the most common bat in Ohio is. That's a really good question. So there's a disease that's killed a lot of bats in the eastern US. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little while. I would say probably before that disease, little brown bats would probably be the most common bats in Ohio. But I don't know if that's true now that the disease has killed so many bats. So that might be a question that we don't know the answer to just yet. All right, let's see. How many bones do bats have? Ooh, that's another one that I don't know the exact answer to. Their skeleton is really similar to ours, that picture I showed earlier. So I think they have a similar number of bones to humans, but I'm not 100% sure exactly on the number of bones they have, but I bet that's one you could probably look up online. Mrs. Stella and Mrs. B's class said, do vampire bats ever eat anything other than blood? No, they actually don't. Vampire bats are, they can only eat blood. They have everything in their whole body is really specialized for them to eat blood, so they can't eat other food. And one really cool thing about vampire bats is that if like their friends that live in their colony don't get a meal, they'll actually share some of their meal with them. So kind of sounds gross, but they'll come back and they'll actually regurgitate some of the blood that they've eaten to share it with other bats in their colony that may not have been able to get a meal. So that's actually really cool. Bats taking care of other bats that aren't their own babies. It's a kind of unique thing about bats. Kenyon asks how many years can bats live for? It really depends on the different kinds of bats. There have been some bats that have lived for over 30 years. So they can actually live for a pretty long time. All right, what are predators to bats? There's lots of different kinds of predators for bats, things like owls, raccoons, snakes, foxes, skunks, and mostly those are animals that they would encounter at night. But those are the kinds of things that'll eat bats. All right, let's see. Bridget asked, it got really cold in Illinois this winter. Do you think it harmed the native bats? Well, Bridget, I would say you probably have some bats that went south for the winter, they migrated. And then you probably have some bats that hibernate, and they hibernate in places like caves and mines. And in caves and mines, the temperature stays pretty steady in the winter. So even if it gets really cold outside, it's usually about the same temperature inside the cave. So it doesn't fluctuate as much as the outside temperature, so it probably didn't cause any issues directly to those bats. Okay, a couple more here, and then I'm going to move on. What's the fastest bat? The fastest bat that I know of is a Mexican free-tailed bat. They fly up to 100 miles an hour. They're super duper fast. And they also fly really high up in the air. They can fly up to 10,000 feet. So they go really high up and they go really fast, and they're really cool bats. Okay, I'm gonna move on, and then I'll come back to some of these questions. I want to make sure that we get through all the information. So wondering if you guys have any ideas about the answer to what the biggest threat to bats is. I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. And then I'm going to tell you the answer, which is humans. Yep, humans are the biggest threat to bats. There's lots and lots and lots of humans in the world. Over 7 billion people live on Earth. And because there's so many people and there are getting to be more and more people, bats are having less and less places to live. Part of that's because we need land for homes, we need resources for building, we need places to grow crops for food. So a lot of their habitat has been lost. We've cut down a lot of forests, either for those resources or to build homes for ourselves, or to convert it over for land for food production. And so a lot of that bat habitat has disappeared. We also have damaged a lot of the habitat that bats use. So caves, people do things like dump their trash in the caves, or they might fill the cave up with cement or something if they're trying to build. So we've destroyed a lot of bat habitat that way. We also are causing climate change. Human beings burning fossil fuel is changing the climate, and that's affecting bats as well, both directly through things like increased big storms are causing more damage to areas that bats live, but also because we're changing where different plants grow, where different insects live, the timing of those things blooming and insects hatching. So we're really having a lot of impacts on bats. We also use a lot of pesticides on our crops, and pesticides can be poisonous to bats. So they can either get pesticides, come in contact with them on plants or trees. They might eat insects that have been sprayed with pesticides. So a lot of bats get poisoned by pesticides. Bats are also affected by our pollution. So things like acid mine drainage going into the water and polluting water. Bats actually drink water just like humans. They have to drink water to survive, and they actually fly down and scoop a little bit of water off the surface of things like rivers and lakes. And so when that water is polluted, it can be a way that bats can get chemicals that can cause them harm. We also disturb bats. So some bats, like I said, some bats hibernate in caves and mines in the winter, but also some bats live in caves and mines year round. So people like to explore caves and mines and not always respectful to the fact that bats might be in there. So we disturb them either while they're hibernating. They might wake up and it causes them to burn through some of that fat that they've stored for the winter. Or some bats that live in caves year round have their babies in the cave. And if there's too much human disturbance, it might make the female bats, the mother bats, abandon their young in the cave, and then those babies are unable to survive without their mothers. Wind energy can also be a threat to bats. Wind energy is actually really important. It's a really good thing. But it does have some unintended consequences for bats and also birds. Bats can have strikes with the blades of those wind turbines. So those wind turbines are really huge, and those blades are going really, really fast. They're going like 200 miles an hour at the tip of the blade. And so a bat might be flying along and echolocating, and there's nothing there in front of them when they echolocate, but then all of a sudden the blade is there and they have an impact with the blade. So we do need to work on ways to develop sustainable energy like wind energy and solar. The good thing for bats with wind energy is using science, we've learned that there's ways that we can reduce those impacts to bats. So we can slow those turbines down if there are a lot of bats around. We can turn them off during times where there's not a lot of wind, so they're not really producing much energy anyway. That's more often when there are a lot of bats out if it's not super windy. So there are good things that we can do to help reduce those impacts to bats. And there's also a disease called white nose syndrome, and depending on where you live in the country, white nose syndrome might be there and impacting your bats. I'll show you a map in just a few minutes that shows where white nose syndrome is. This is a picture on the right of a bat that has white nose syndrome. You can see it's got white fuzzy fungus growing all over its face and its ears and its forearms and wings. You can tell why they started calling it white nose syndrome, because that white fuzzy stuff that grows on their face. And the picture on the left is actually a really sad picture. This is a picture of a cave in New York, and it might be kind of hard to tell depending on your screen, but all those little dark things on the floor are actually bats that have died from white nose syndrome. So what is white nose syndrome? You might remember I was talking about how some bats hibernate in the winter and some bats migrate in the winter. Well, this is a disease that only affects hibernating bats. So those migrating bats that go away for the winter, they're okay. They don't get white nose syndrome. They have other threats to them, but not this disease. But hibernating bats can be affected by white nose syndrome. So it's caused by a fungus that's a cold-loving fungus. So somebody asked earlier about the cave temperature. If it gets too cold, if it'll impact the bats, and I said it stays pretty steady. Well, this fungus is a cold-loving fungus. It loves that kind of like colder temperature between 41 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right about where caves usually are in the winter. So that fungus works out that it loves the temperature that caves are. This disease has really high mortality rates. So that means like if bats get the disease, they're really likely to die, and a lot of bats die from it. It's affecting lots of different species of bats. So you might remember I said we have 47 bat species in the US. About half of those species of bats are hibernating bats. So this disease could impact half of our bat species in the US. But I should point out here that this disease is not a threat to humans or pets or livestock. So you may have learned a little bit about the disease triangle at school. This is the three things that are needed for there to be a disease: a host, a pathogen, and an environment. So in this case, we'll talk about the pathogen. It's this fungus. It's called Pseudogymnoascus destructans. It's a newly described species of fungus. So we didn't even know this existed before our bats started getting sick. Like I said, it grows in that temperature range, 41 to 57, which is right about the temperature that most caves are that bats hibernated. And this fungus is really bad because what it does is it actually starts growing on the bat's skin, but it actually invades down into their tissue. So it's disrupting lots of things inside of their skin, like their blood flow, like their ability to stay warm, to keep their bodies warm and things like that. We have found this fungus in European and Asian bats, but it doesn't seem to cause the same kind of mortality that it causes here in the US. Environment, we talked a bit about caves. This is a little bit older map, but the red part is all places where there's caves in the US. And then all those little yellow squares are places where we have detected white nose syndrome in bats. So you can see that lots of the places with caves also have the disease. And then what the host is in this case, is bats. Here's a bunch of the different kinds of species of bats that are impacted by white nose syndrome. And I remember someone asked earlier what the most common bat in Ohio was, and I see what's the least common bat in Kentucky. Those are really hard questions to answer, because this disease has been changing how many bats there are. So what we might have thought was the answer a few years ago might be different nowadays. So these 9 species of bats have all been detected with white nose syndrome. So how does this disease get spread around? Well, bats spread it around pretty well themselves. Once a bat gets fungus on it, it can fly really far distances, and it might interact with other bats, and it can spread the fungus that way. But also, it's possible that people can move the fungus. So whether that's people like scientists that are studying bats, or people that are out exploring caves, we have to be really careful not to move the fungus from cave to cave so that we're exposing more bats to it. So this is the map of where the fungus or the disease is in the U.S. Right now. So this is mostly from data from last year. So we'll probably, unfortunately, have new places that we find the disease this winter. But you can see it's pretty well across the whole eastern part of the country and Canada, and it's starting to spread into kind of the central and western part of the country as well. So unfortunately, we don't have any way to stop it right now. So it's likely it'll be in pretty much every state in all of Canada at some point in the future. So what happens? What's the impacts to bats? Well, unfortunately, once this disease takes hold in a bat population, usually that bat population really crashes. So this is a graph showing a couple of caves in New York State. And on the left side, you can see what the bat population looked like before the disease got there. And then you can see over time, as you go to the right, that those populations all sort of crash. So once the disease gets there, those populations really plummet because so many bats die. This is a picture from one of those caves. So one really cool thing, somebody asked earlier about bats and how long they live. They do live a really long time, and they also go back to the same cave every year to hibernate. And they go back to the same maternity colonies every year to have their babies. So this is some pictures from a cave in New York. And the top, those are Indiana bats, and they're all clustered together. So in the winter when they're hibernating, they squeeze in real tight so that they can help conserve energy by staying warm, by sharing body heat with their neighbors. And bats even like to go back to the same exact place in the same exact cave every year. So you can see over time, these pictures, once the disease got there around 2010, so those first two pictures are before the disease got there, and then the second two pictures on the bottom are after the disease got there. And you can see that a lot of those bats that lived in that cave previously had died. This is some really sad pictures. I took these pictures in a cave in Vermont, where historically there were hundreds of thousands of bats. It was the biggest bat colony, Hibernacula, in New England. There are about 300,000 bats in there. And when I went to visit in 2010, the first room that you go into usually had about 1,000 to 3,000 bats in it. And when I went there in 2010, there were only 35 bats left in that room. It was really, really sad. You can see all those sad little bat skulls and stuff on the floor of the cave. I had a really hard time. I cried a lot. That was the first time I saw how bad this disease was, and it made me really, really sad. So unfortunately, we think that this disease could potentially make some bat species go extinct over time, because it continues to kill bats over time. So even if there's new baby bats that are born, they can get the disease and die too. Bats live a long time and they reproduce really slowly. They usually only have one baby every year, but they might have two. Unfortunately, this disease is probably going to make some bat species go extinct. So what does that mean? What happens if bats go extinct? Well, don't forget that bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects. So all those crop and forest pests that they eat, there'll be nobody there to eat them. So that could cost farmers billions of dollars annually because they have to put more pesticides. That means also that could make our groceries more expensive, and it could have other impacts to environmental and human health, using more chemicals in the environment. Hibernating bats are also a really important part of cave ecosystems. So there's other critters that live in the cave, and they depend on bats because bats bring in a lot of nutrients, whether it's the guano or bats that die and fall to the cave floor. If there's no bats in there, there won't be as much food for the other animals that depend on bats. And also, just a loss of species diversity makes everything less healthy. So having lots of different kinds of species on the landscapes makes a healthier environment. And so if we lose a bunch of bat species, we will have lost a bunch of diversity. So you might wonder what we're doing about it. Well, we're doing a lot of things about it, actually. We're working really closely with other partners, so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the state wildlife agencies, other university research and things like that, to try to figure out how we might be able to help bats survive this disease. We do things like develop a decontamination protocol. So I mentioned before, we want to be careful that we don't accidentally track this fungus from one cave to another. So there's actually a protocol out there that talks about how you can clean your clothing and your footwear and your gear after visiting a cave to make sure that you don't accidentally take that fungus with you and go to a different cave and contaminate that cave as well. We're also working to protect and conserve habitat. So we're really lucky to live in a country that has things like national parks and national forests, and that we protect those areas, and state parks and things like that. So we're working to protect some of that habitat that's really important to bats. And you might wonder what you can do important to bats. And you might wonder what you can do. You can actually do a lot. You can educate yourself and others about bats. You can do things like build a bat house, put up bat houses. You can take note of bats in your area. If you are out walking outside in the evening in the summertime or something like that, and you see bats coming out of a building or something like that, you can report those bat colonies to state wildlife agencies, and they can check on them and make sure that they're healthy. And someone had asked earlier about bats behaving oddly, things like flying in the daytime. So that's also a symptom of white nose syndrome. So not all bats that are outside in the daytime have rabies, but if you do see bats flying around in the day, you might want to contact your state wildlife agency and let them know. If you do like to go to caves, depending on where you live in the country, you should always decontaminate your clothing and footwear and gear before and after you visit a cave, so that you make sure you don't accidentally bring some of the fungus to that cave and impact bats that could live there. Like I said before, don't ever touch a bat. If you ever find a bat or see bats somewhere, don't touch them, because they can actually carry disease. But also bats are really delicate, and you could actually hurt them pretty easily. So it's really important not to touch them. If you do see bats, you should always go find an adult and tell them about it. The main thing you can do is teach other people to care about bats, because that helps everybody. So thank you for listening. I know we've got some more questions over here. I'll try to answer those for you before we go. We've got about 18 minutes left, so we do have some time for questions. So let me go back over here. All right. Let's see. Can bats swim? Actually, there are some bats. I've seen videos of bats swimming. I don't think they do it on purpose. They might accidentally get in the water, but I have seen bats swimming, videos of bats swimming, and I've actually seen a bat myself. One time I was out canoeing and I saw a bat accidentally get in the water, and then it was able to like kind of swim a little bit until it took off. So I don't think they like it. They're not trying to go swimming, but I have seen that happen. Let's see. What's the main reason that I work with bats? From Reese in Mrs. B's class. I really love bats. I think they're really unique animals. I think they're really important animals. And I think like a lot of people don't really know enough about them to like them. And I think it's really important that people try to help other people understand why animals that are maybe not considered the like cute cuddly animals are really important, and that we need to care about them too. So that's one reason I want to help other people care about bats. All right, David H. How can you tell the gender of a bat? So it depends on the time of year. Usually like in the summer when we're working with bats, the way that we can tell is for female bats, they actually have nipples that they feed their babies, the bat pups, milk. And so this is kind of funny. It's going to sound funny, but their nipples are kind of in their armpits. So if you catch a bat, you blow on their fur a little bit to kind of spread it apart, and then you can actually see those nipples if they're female bats. So that's how we can tell if they're female bats. Male bats are a little bit harder because they're so furry, but in the fall, especially when bats are mating, if we catch a bat, we can also tell if it's a male bat because their genital area is usually a little bit more visible through their fur. So we can actually just look for physical signs of whether if they're females, if they have nipples, or if they're males, if they have visible genitalia. All right, let's see here. Where do bats get their name from? So the scientific name for bats, for the big group of bats, is Chiroptera, which means hand wing. So if you remember back a while ago, I showed you the picture of their skeleton and that their wing has pretty much the same bones as our hand. So that's where they get that name. The individual species have lots of different scientific names, and then they also have common names. So for example, that bat in the picture that you can see right now is called a little brown bat, which is a pretty good description of it. It's a little brown bat. There's also big brown bats and all different kinds of bats, long-eared bats, free-tailed bats. So those names are often, those common names are often some physical description of the animal. And then the scientific names sometimes have to do with their physical description, or sometimes have to do with the name of the person that maybe discovered them or was really important in studying them. All right, let's see. Do I love any other animals? Oh gosh, I love all kinds of animals. Bats are probably my top favorite kind of animals, but I also really love lots of other animals. I really like salamanders. I think salamanders are really cool. I really like grizzly bears and wolves and some of those animals that are really kind of wild animals that sometimes people are scared of. So maybe I like animals that sometimes other people don't like so much, but bats are definitely my favorite. All right, if an animal eats a bat with a disease, will they catch that disease from Melody? Well, if we're talking about white nose syndrome, no. That is only, as far as we know, a disease that bats can get. If an animal eats a bat with another disease, that's a really good question. If they can get the disease or not, it probably depends on what kind of disease it is, but I'm not 100% sure about that. All right, where do bumblebee bats live? They live in Thailand and Burma and Southeast Asia. Have I ever worked with bumblebee bats? If not, what is the smallest bat you've ever worked with? I haven't worked with bumblebee bats. I've been to different parts of the world, but I've never been to Southeast Asia, so I haven't gotten to work with bumblebee bats yet. The smallest bat I've worked with is probably the tricolored bat. It's a little, teeny little bat that lives mostly in the eastern US. It's a bat that has, unfortunately, can get white nose syndrome, so there's not as many tricolored bats left as there used to be, but I really think they're super cute. They have kind of like reddish orange fur. They call it a tricolored bat because its fur is different color at the bottom to the tip. It's kind of got like a little white tip and it's darker at the base. And they're really cute. They have pink noses and pink forearms. So you can look those guys up. They're super cute. All right, let's see. Jackson, do bats digest things similar to humans? That's a really great question. Yes, they do digest things similar to humans. The only thing that might be different would be like vampire bats have a very specialized digestive tract. It's because they only eat blood, they don't eat solid food. Their system is a bit different. But most of the insectivorous bats and most of the fruit-eating bats, they do just like us. They chew up food, they swallow it, it goes into their stomach and their intestines, and then they pass it out as a bowel movement, like guano, like I said before, is what bat poo is called. How much food do bats need to eat during hibernation? That's a really great question that came from Kason. Bats actually don't eat when they're hibernating, so they eat a whole lot in the fall before they go into hibernation, so they get kind of chunky, and then they go into hibernation, and then they basically hibernate all winter. They don't eat any food. They might wake up and move around a little bit a couple times, and sometimes they'll get a little drink of water if they do that, but they don't usually eat any food during the winter time. Are bats flexible? Yeah, they actually are. And bats are, one really cool thing about bats is that their wings have all the same joints in them that our fingers do. So they can make their wings into just hundreds of different kinds of shapes depending on which joint they bend and flex. And that's a little bit different than birds who have stiff wings that only fold in a couple places. So bats' wings are really super flexible and all kinds of different shapes, which makes them really excellent flyers, which is so cool. And they also, they're pretty bendy. They catch insects when they're flying, and they'll like curl their tails around and do all kinds of acrobatics in the air. You can probably look up some videos of bats catching insects and you'll see what I mean. Okay, Huntsville, how are they working on treating white nose syndrome? That's a really great question. So we're actually working on lots of different ideas for how we can treat white nose syndrome. So things like studying other bacteria or chemicals that might be able to kill the fungus, working on things like maybe potentially developing a vaccine that could be delivered to bats. So we actually have quite a bit of research going on all over the country looking at different ways that we might be able to treat white nose syndrome. We do know lots of things that will kill the fungus in the lab. So we know chemical compounds, bacteria, things like that that will actually kill the fungus in the lab. But then taking that and figuring out how to give it to bats in the wild is the next step of trying to figure that out. So there's definitely people looking at different ways that we might be able to deliver something to bats, whether it's like maybe they fly through a mist when they're coming into a cave, or is it a vaccine that we can give to bats when we have them in hand, things like that. So there's a lot of research going on. That's a really great question. Let's see. All right, are some species of bats more susceptible to white nose than others? That's a really great question, Bridget. Yes, that there are some species that are more susceptible than others. So a lot of the smaller bats are really more susceptible to it. So for example, in this picture here, the little brown bat, which is a lot smaller than the big brown bat. Little brown bats' mortality rate is a lot higher than the mortality rate for big brown bats. So that's a really great question. And there are some bats in the western US where we don't have white nose syndrome yet, that we don't know if they're going to get it or not. So lots of unanswered questions still when it comes to white nose syndrome. How many teeth does a typical bat have? That's another question I know the answer to, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I think they have a similar number of teeth as humans. That'd be another good one to look up on the internet. I bet you can find the answer to that one pretty quickly. Okay, Kenyon, do they have any evidence of a bat with the disease that have developed a resistance to it and survived? Excellent question. We do know that some bats can survive with white nose syndrome. We have evidence of bats that have survived multiple years because we can identify individual bats by putting a small band on their wing. It's just kind of like a little clamp that clamps on their wing. It can move around so it doesn't hurt them at all. And so we know and have documented bats that have lived through having white nose syndrome and survived. That's one of the things we're actually studying right now is whether those bats are developing any sort of resistance to it, or if they are just less susceptible to the disease. So that's a good question and one we're still working on trying to figure out. And we're definitely looking at those bats that are surviving to try to understand why those bats are surviving and some other bats aren't. So that's a really great question. Can you keep a bat as a pet? No, most states will not allow you to keep a bat as a pet. There are exceptions, I think I said before, for educational bats. So like if a bat came into a wildlife care center that had a broken wing or something and could not fly again, they might allow a licensed rehabber, somebody that has a license to keep an animal for education, keep that bat to use it to help people learn more about bats, but they're not kept as pets. Okay. Do bats contract diseases from mosquitoes like humans and animals do? That's a good question too. I don't know the answer to that one. There are lots of bugs that are pests to bats. I've actually caught bats and they've had little bat flies and ticks and things on them. So I know that other insects can bite bats. But I don't know for sure if they can get a disease from mosquitoes like humans. Okay, where can I purchase the bat monitor for my phone to use at my nature center? So the one that I have is from Wildlife Acoustics. There's a number of different ones out there, but they have one that's specially designed for non-expert people too, that helps you can tell it what state you're in, and it will help identify specific species for you based on where you are geographically. So I really like that one because you don't have to be an expert to use it. And when I go to different states, I can switch it to that state and have an idea of what bats I'm listening to. So that was from Wildlife Acoustics, the one that I have. But I know there's other brands out there. That one's just the one that I have experience with that works with iPhones and Android phones. Okay, Kenyan kids had to pass the next class. Thank you. All right. Who's a better flyer, bats or birds? We got a couple minutes left, so I'll try to get through these. Oh, that's a good question. If you ask some bird people, they might say birds, and if you ask some bat people, they might say bats. I think it probably just depends on what we're talking about. Are we talking about speed? Are we talking about agility? So could be bats or could be birds, depending on more specifically. I think bats are really super agile flyers for the reason I said before, because they can make their wings into all different kinds of shapes. So that makes them really excellent flyers. All right, looks like people are dropping off, so I'm going to answer this one last question here. Can you bait bats with vaccines like they drop rabies vaccines for raccoons, maybe dusting insects with a compound? From Huntsville. I think that's a really great idea. And I know they're looking at lots of different delivery methods, so that might be one that they're considering, whether they could deliver it through their food source, which would be insects. But I guess that remains to be seen, but great idea. Okay, thank you, everyone. I will hopefully see some of you next year, your classrooms next year, and I hope that you guys learned a lot about bats today, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.